And now we go to our reading from one of my favorite people, the beloved Mr. Rogers, who radically expanded the idea of neighboring and made a lot of people angry in the process. He said, "All of us at some time or other need help. Whether we're giving or receiving help, each one of us has something valuable to bring to this world. That's one of the things that connects us as neighbors. In our own way, each one of us is a giver and a receiver." During Rabbi Jesus's ministry, an expert in the law came to him and asked, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" We might translate that as, "What must I do to live a well-lived life?" Rabbi Jesus turned the question on him, and he gave the first two commandments of loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself. Then Rabbi Jesus said something like, "That's a good answer," but the expert pursued his question with, "Who is my neighbor?" I imagine that Rabbi Jesus looked at him for a minute or so, took a deep breath, and then told him a story that has been told and retold by faith communities for millennia. The story begins with, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. We don't know anything about the identity of this man who was traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. If he had had any identity on him, such as fancy biker clothing or bumper stickers that told of his political inclinations, all of it was gone. He was just a human without other identifying markings, a human wounded on the side of the road. He had no markings that might give a connection to someone walking by. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. Not just passed by, but went across the road so that he wouldn't have to see the injured man too closely. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, did the same thing. He went over to the other side of the road and left him there. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, his heart went out, and he took pity on him. The Samaritans were a group of people who lived in an area called Samaria that was north of Jerusalem. They were not accepted by other people. They were different. They had intermarried with Assyrians, and they were not considered to be Jews. And at the time of Jesus, the Jews and the Samaritans did not deal with one another. But that Samaritan, he went to the man and bandaged his wounds, the man who had no identity, pouring on his wounds oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. He took care of him the whole day. The next day, he took out 2 denarii, and he gave them to the innkeeper. "Look after him," he said, "and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense that you may have." And after the story, this question came out of Rabbi Jesus's mouth: Which of these three, he asked the man, do you think was a neighbor? A neighbor, that word, to the man who fell into the hands of robbers. The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus said to him, go and do likewise. In this story, Rabbi Jesus wanted to expand the concept of whose lives are worthy of our love and care. Who is our neighbor? To whom do we have responsibility? And this story has echoed in many buildings throughout the last millennia. And people have had to think, who is our neighbor? I wonder if the man in the parable prepared for his journey like I had, with hydrating crystals to add to my water so that I wouldn't get dehydrated, and all manner of rain gear that could keep me safe on that one day of rain, heavy rain. But for that man, everything went wrong, like it could have for me. I passed the roadside shrines to pilgrims who had fallen off mountains or been hit by cars. And this man in the parable, he was attacked by robbers who beat him and went on their way, leaving him bleeding by the roadside. On my pilgrimage, I was prepared for every possible difficulty, and I shared the bounty in my backpack. I was the one with special bandages for blisters to pass out to fellow walkers who were in pain, and oatmeal bars with fruit and nuts to those who were hungry. Some days I walked alone, and after an entire day of being mostly alone, I was ready to talk with someone. On that one day of my pilgrimage when it rained very hard, and I set out prepared with rain pants and a good jacket and layers of lightweight wool for the cold and waterproof hiking boots. As I left town, I noticed one of the hikers who was leaving at the same time I was. He was not as well prepared as I was. He wore this kind of funny winter sweater, and his backpack had seen many nights outside. It was very stained. His hiking boots did not come from REI. They were rubber boots with thick linings for winter use that had zippers that weren't zipped. To me, they looked like awful blister makers. I couldn't guess his age by his salt and pepper hair or beard. And as sometimes happened, we had a similar rhythm, and naturally began walking side by side on the wide path. Sometimes I passed him, and then he would pass me. In the silence, I began to hear a very distinct message that I needed to ask him where he was from. I asked him in Spanish, and he responded in French that he was from Lebanon. From that moment, his story unfolded, as did our connections, for Lebanon was a place of my childhood when it was peaceful, and Beirut was called the Paris of the East. His name was Joseph, and he had walked all the way from Lausanne, Switzerland. Imagine, those of you who can think of a map, his feet had taken him all the way from Lausanne. And gradually, I learned about where his clothing had come from. The sweater was a gift of a Catholic priest in Switzerland. His shoes were also a gift from a kind person along the way. His scars that he had on his neck were from a recent surgery in Switzerland. He had walked this pilgrimage route enough times to have logged in over 5,000 kilometers. He had his credential, which is a booklet where you collect stamps, with all the stamps. And he had a photograph with his passport of a much younger Joseph being blessed by Pope John Paul II. The day before, he had walked 35 kilometers, and he had arrived so late at the hostel that he had slept in front of its doors on the sidewalk. And he said the Guardia Civil had not bothered him at all. Usually, he told me, he slept in cemeteries on the gravestones, those flat gravestones that you may have seen in European cemeteries. They are good, he said, because creatures cannot climb up the sides. You only have to watch for snakes. But the cemetery of that town had been closed. I had walked through it the night before. It must have been a place for people to gather, to drink and do drugs, because there was lots of broken glass there, and the city closed it at night. So as we walked together, at one point we turned a corner and he recognized a woman who had a little stall by the road called El Pequeño Oasis, the little oasis. He had met her years before on one of his other pilgrimages, and she remembered him by his picture with the Pope, which he showed everyone. We sat on the log by her little stand for a long time. He insisted on buying me coffee, and she offered us a piece of fresh cheese, a membrillo, which is a kind of like a jam. I offered him the dinner that was down in my backpack. He refused for a few minutes and then admitted that he hadn't eaten since the morning before. The meal was perfect for him, but after that, he refused to allow me to pay for anything. If he bought an ice cream, he would get a plate for me and give me half of it. Our giving and receiving happened on many levels. I was afraid of his blisters, and he was afraid that I might have pain in my heart. Every few minutes, he asked me, "Are you okay? Vous allez bien, madame?" We told stories of Coptic saints in which we had a shared interest, and we laughed about life and talked of what was most important to us. We were two humans connecting with each other, and each of us wanted to be the one who was giving to the other, and that necessitated receiving. I smile today thinking of that long day encounter. I wonder where he is now. He was a stranger who became a friend, a companion on my journey, a neighbor. In order to become a neighbor, as I believe, we're becoming on that day, Mr. Rogers advised in the reading that we have to be willing to receive as well as give. And when I asked for stories, I asked all of you in my video for stories about neighbors. Leslie Grady wrote to me about the neighbor who waters their plants and helps take out the trash, takes those trash cans up their hill, and many other kindnesses. Often it's this kind of need, a kind of daily need, that has helped Mary Lou and me reach out to people around us. We really don't want to, but we suddenly have to. There's something small like that, but it needs to be done. And so no matter how self-sufficient we would like to be, and I think we could write a book on self-sufficiency, we need other people. And although it is difficult to receive, I believe that receiving is the way that we become neighbors. Unwillingness to receive shuts people out and leads into that great illness of the 21st century, loneliness. The Economist has called loneliness the leprosy of the 21st century. So, to stay away from that scourge of loneliness, we must be willing to receive. I imagine that those of you who've never been mentioned in our time of joys and sorrows might not know how hard it can be to hear your own name, or to have people bringing you food, or taking you to doctor's appointments, or calling to see how you are. For some, receiving is not hard, but there are many joys and sorrows within this community, within the people we know, that are unexpressed, that are not told to us until much later, because for some, the experience of receiving in a time of difficulty is very hard. Many of us have worked our whole lives to think of every possible illness or problem that might befall us. And then we go on a journey, such as the one Karen Anderson and her partner Dave embarked on around 1 year ago. And the unforeseen happens, and suddenly we are by the side of the road in desperate need of an ambulance. Do you know that many cars went by, and the one that stopped was filled with people who spoke Spanish? Other people had driven by, thinking as we do, someone must have called 911. Somehow, like the priest and Levite in the parable, somehow they found a way to isolate themselves from what was happening, thinking perhaps that they needed to be on schedule. I want us to be a people who would stop at the side of the road. And when that time comes, when we must reach out, when we have reached the limits of our well thought out, excuse me, and carefully built self-sufficiency, when that time comes to reach out, those of us who are experiencing tragedies are faced with opening ourselves to receive. And I believe that it is in that transition that happens within us, that transition to openness to receive, and then the giving and receiving. I believe that it is in those moments that we become neighbors. On Thursday, excuse me, on Thursday, a young man living in the US Vets housing across the street from our building came to me and he said, "I'd love to volunteer here. What can I do?" And we are ready to give to people who come to us, but we will be making true neighbors if we can learn how to receive from them as well. He is a musician, and he also doesn't mind cutting weeds. And I've connected with him with people in our community who I hope get him involved and receive from this young man who wants to give. I also that day spent time with a mother whose family has been lifted by our food pantry, and she lifted my heart as we talked of her family in our neighborhood and her family in Guanajuato, Mexico. We are becoming neighbors. When I envisioned the neighborhood outreach ministry, I hoped for this back and forth, this give and take. We have extended our sense of neighbor through our giving, through providing much needed non-perishable food products through our pantry to give families living on one, sometimes two incomes, but minimum wage incomes, with families of 4 or 6 or more. And I wonder what there will be for us to receive, these gifts of connection. On Saturday, after I went to the farmer's market, which is one of my favorite places to go in Prescott, I saw good neighboring when we drove past the men's group that comprised men I didn't know, that was showing me that the circle has been drawn wider than the people who have signed our membership book. I've seen members of that group stand by one another, giving and receiving. At our worship retreat, we decided on the theme of fuller circle. We are returning to our building, coming full circle in a way, but we want that circle to be drawn wider. And that involves the spiritual work of expanding our ideas of who is our neighbor, and not just our neighbor to receive from us, but for giving and receiving, and going into the giving, understanding how difficult it is for us to receive. What can we do? I believe that we need to open ourselves to receiving, both when we are in need and in our interactions with people around us. One movement that is transforming congregations around the country is a neighboring movement born in Kansas, which begins by individuals learning about people who live behind the 8 front doors nearest to their own door. They exchange names and phone numbers, and then they host gatherings. And I signed up yesterday. I have heard that congregations that do this, in the process, they learn how to be neighbors around their building. This is important because I believe this is the good medicine for that pandemic of loneliness. The world needs desperately to renew the habit of neighboring. Together, let us open our hearts to become two-way streets of giving and receiving. Let us become neighbors in ever-widening circles as we walk this path together. Amen, and may it be so.